Hello, friend. Welcome back to another journey through time. I'm so glad you're here tonight or whenever you're listening to this. Maybe it's late. Maybe you're struggling to quiet your mind. Maybe you just want to learn something fascinating while you drift off to sleep. Whatever brought you here, you're exactly where you need to be. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillows, pull your blankets up just right. Let your body sink into your bed. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to do. Just listen and let yourself relax. Tonight we're going on a journey that might make you deeply, profoundly grateful. Grateful for things you probably never even think about. Because we're traveling back to biblical times, to an era where something as simple as a headache could ruin your entire week, where a fever might mean your death, where getting sick wasn't just uncomfortable, it was catastrophic. I want you to imagine waking up tomorrow morning with a throbbing headache. What's the first thing you'd do? Probably reach for some ibuprofen, right? Maybe some Tylenol. Within 30 minutes, that pain would fade. You'd go about your day. You'd forget it ever happened. Now imagine that same headache, but there's no medicine cabinet. No pills, no relief. That pain just continues, hour after hour, day after day. And there's absolutely nothing you can do about it except endure it. Just endure it. That was life in biblical times. Tonight, we're going to explore why being sick 2,000 years ago was a nightmare beyond what most of us can imagine. We'll discover what it meant to live without painkillers, without anesthesia, without any real understanding of what caused disease. We'll learn about the social isolation that came with certain illnesses, about how mental health conditions were seen as demon possession, about crude surgeries performed on fully conscious patients, and about why childbirth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could face. And then, after we've walked through this ancient world together, I'm going to tell you 3 specific stories. 3 people from the Bible whose experiences of sickness and suffering reveal something profound about what it really meant to be sick in those times. We'll meet a woman who bled for 12 straight years, who spent everything she had searching for a cure, who became a social outcast because of her condition. We'll meet a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, whose disability meant a life of complete dependence, of sitting by the roadside every single day just hoping for coins. And we'll witness the death and burial of Lazarus and understand the ancient customs surrounding death, the finality of it all, the acceptance that once someone got sick enough, they were simply going to die. But don't worry about remembering all of this. Don't worry about staying awake for every detail. This story is designed to carry you into sleep. If you drift off 5 minutes from now or 50 minutes from now, that's exactly what should happen. Let the words wash over you like waves. Let the rhythm of the story pull you deeper into rest. Your only job tonight is to relax. So settle in, close your eyes if you haven't already, and let's travel back together. Back to a time when medicine was primitive, when suffering was constant, when being sick didn't just mean discomfort. It meant your entire life could unravel. Let's begin. Picture yourself waking up in ancient Judea, maybe around 30 A.D. It's just before dawn. The air is cool, that brief, blessed coolness before the desert sun begins its relentless climb. You're lying on a thin mat on a hard-packed dirt floor. Your blanket is rough wool, scratchy against your skin, and as consciousness returns to you, so does the pain. Maybe it's your tooth, that grinding, throbbing ache in your back molar that's been bothering you for weeks now. The kind of pain that makes your whole jaw feel swollen, that sends shooting sensations up into your temple with every heartbeat. Or maybe it's your head, a splitting headache that feels like someone's driving a spike through your skull. Or perhaps it's your joints, your knees, or your back, that constant, grinding discomfort that comes from a lifetime of manual labor, of sleeping on hard surfaces, of bodies wearing down without any way to heal them properly. The pain is there. It's real, it's consuming, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. No aspirin, no ibuprofen, no Tylenol. No prescription painkillers, no numbing agents, no cortisone shots, no physical therapy, nothing. The medicine cabinet doesn't exist because medicine as we know it doesn't exist. You might have some myrrh if you're wealthy. It's a resin that can be chewed or mixed with wine, and it does provide some minor relief. Some slight dulling of the edges of pain, but it's expensive and it doesn't really solve anything. It just makes the suffering slightly more bearable. Slightly. There's frankincense too, another aromatic resin that can be burned or mixed into oils. Some people swear it helps with inflammation. Maybe it does, a little. But we're talking about minimal relief here. We're talking about the difference between a pain level of 8 and a pain level of 7.5. If you're poor, and most people were poor, you might have access to some hyssop. It's a common herb that grows wild. You can make it into a tea. It might help with congestion or minor aches, but for real pain, for serious discomfort, it's basically useless. So you lie there on your mat and you breathe through it. You've learned to breathe through pain. Everyone has. Because pain is just part of life. Constant. Relentless. Unavoidable. That toothache I mentioned? In our modern world, you'd go to a dentist. They'd numb your mouth, you wouldn't feel a thing, and they'd either fill the cavity or extract the tooth. Done. Over. Relief. In biblical times, if the pain got bad enough, truly unbearable, someone might extract your tooth for you. But there's no Novocaine, no anesthesia. They'd have you drink some strong wine to dull your senses. Then they'd take a crude iron tool, rip your tooth and yank. You'd feel everything. Every nerve screaming, every bit of tissue tearing, the crunch of roots breaking, the hot rush of blood filling your mouth. And then, assuming you didn't die from infection afterward, you'd have a hole in your mouth forever, one less tooth to chew with. And if you lost enough teeth, your ability to eat would become compromised. Your health would decline. Your life would shorten, all from a toothache. Let's talk about headaches for a moment. You've had headaches. Everyone has. Maybe you get migraines, those devastating attacks that make you want to lie in a dark room and disappear. In our time, there are medications specifically designed for migraines. Triptans, preventive medications, rescue medications, pain management strategies. 2,000 years ago, you suffered. That's it. You suffered. Maybe you'd tie a cloth tightly around your head. Pressure sometimes helped. Maybe you'd lie down in the coolest, darkest place you could find, usually a corner of your small house, and just wait for it to pass. Hours. Sometimes days. And if you got chronic headaches, if this was a regular occurrence, your life would become defined by pain. Your ability to work would be compromised. Your relationships would strain under the weight of your constant suffering. People would begin to wonder if you were cursed, if you'd sinned, if God was punishing you for something. because that's how they understood chronic pain back then, not as a medical issue, but as a spiritual one. Now imagine arthritis, that grinding pain in your joints. In our world, we have anti-inflammatory medications. We have joint replacement surgery. We have physical therapy and pain management clinics. In biblical times, you just got worse. Year by year, your mobility would decrease. Your pain would increase. You'd watch your hands curl into useless claws. You'd feel your knees deteriorate until walking became agony, until you couldn't work anymore, until you became dependent on your family just to survive. And there was no retirement plan, no disability benefits, no social security. If you couldn't work, you relied entirely on the charity of others. And charity, while valued in Jewish culture, was never guaranteed, never enough. The psychological toll of living with constant pain is something we can barely fathom. Yes, we experience pain today, but we experience it with the knowledge that relief is possible, that solutions exist, that medicine can help us. The people of biblical times had no such hope. Pain was permanent. Suffering was guaranteed. Your body would break down, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. So when you woke up in ancient Judea, when that pain flared to life in your tooth or your head or your joints, you didn't reach for medicine. You didn't call a doctor. You just accepted it. You gritted your teeth, you whispered a prayer, and you got up to face another day of suffering. Because what other choice did you have? The sun is rising now, coming through the small window of your home. The day is beginning. The pain continues, and will continue. Day after day after day after day. This was normal. This was life. Let that sink in for a moment as you lie there in your comfortable bed, in your climate-controlled room, with your bottle of pain reliever within arm's reach. Every ache you've ever had that disappeared with medication, imagine it staying forever. Imagine pain as your constant companion, not your occasional visitor. That was the reality for everyone in biblical times. The dawn breaks. The day begins. And the pain, the endless, relentless pain, continues. Now let's talk about something worse than physical pain. Let's talk about what happened when your illness, whatever it was, made you unclean. In ancient Jewish law, in the Levitical code that governed daily life, certain conditions rendered a person ritually unclean, tamai, impure. And when you were unclean, you weren't just sick. You were socially dead. The laws were specific, detailed, unavoidable, and they were designed to protect the community from contagion, from spiritual contamination, from anything that might defile the holy spaces and the holy people. But for the person deemed unclean, these laws were devastating. Let's start with skin diseases. The Hebrew word is tsara'ath, often translated as leprosy in English Bibles, but it probably referred to a variety of skin conditions. Actual leprosy, what we now call Hansen's disease, but also psoriasis, severe eczema, fungal infections, any condition that cause scaling, discoloration, or lesions on the skin. If you developed such a condition, even something relatively minor, you had to go to the priest for inspection. Not a doctor, a priest, because this wasn't considered a medical issue, it was a ritual purity issue. The priest would examine you. He'd look at your skin closely, check for spreading, check for raw flesh, check for white hair growing in the affected area. And if he determined that you were indeed unclean, your life as you knew it was over. Here's what happened next. You were expelled from the community. Immediately, you had to live outside the city walls, in the wilderness, away from everyone and everything you'd ever known. Your home, your family, your children, your spouse, your work, your friends, everything. Gone, and it wasn't temporary. You remained outside the city until if your condition cleared up, which without medical treatment rarely happened. So for most people, this exile was permanent. But it gets worse. You had to mark yourself as unclean. You had to tear your clothes, let your hair hang loose and uncombed, and cover the lower part of your face. And whenever anyone approached you, whenever you saw someone in the distance, you had to call out, "Unclean, unclean." You had to warn people. You had to announce your contamination. You had to participate in your own humiliation. Imagine that for a moment. Really imagine it. You develop a rash. Maybe it's stress-related. Maybe it's an allergic reaction. Maybe it's just bad luck. But it spreads. It looks wrong. So you go to the priest, hoping he'll say it's nothing, but he examines you, and his face tells you everything. You're unclean. Within hours, you're gathering what little you're allowed to take. You're saying goodbye to your children, but you can't hug them, can't touch them. They're crying. Your spouse is crying. You're crying. But the law is the law. You have to leave. You walk out through the city gates. You find the small community of other outcasts, other unclean people living in caves or rough shelters on the outskirts. And this is your life now. You can't work. Who would hire you? Who would let you touch their goods, or their tools, or their animals? You survive on charity, if you're lucky. People from the city might leave food at a designated spot, but they won't come near you. They'll set the food down and back away, and you'll come later to collect it like a stray dog. If you had any money, any savings, you can try to find someone who claims they can cure you. But most of these people are charlatans. They'll take your money, give you some useless ointment or prayer ritual, and your condition will remain. And now you're both sick and poor. The psychological devastation of this cannot be overstated. Human beings need touch. We need connection. We need community. And all of that, all of it, is stripped away. You can't shake someone's hand, can't embrace a friend, can't hold your child, can't lie beside your spouse at night, can't feel another human skin against yours for years, for decades, for the rest of your life. Touch starvation is a real phenomenon. Studies show that humans deprived of physical contact experience depression, anxiety, a sense of disconnection from reality. Their health deteriorates. Their will to live diminishes. And that was the daily reality for anyone deemed unclean. But skin diseases weren't the only conditions that made you unclean. There were others. Women's menstrual cycles made them temporarily unclean. For the duration of their period and for 7 days after, they couldn't go to the temple, couldn't participate in certain rituals. This was manageable because it was temporary and predictable. But what if you had abnormal bleeding? What if you had a condition that caused you to bleed continuously, not just during your regular cycle, but constantly? Then you were permanently unclean, every day, every moment. You couldn't touch anyone, couldn't sit on furniture that others might use, couldn't cook for your family, couldn't live normally. We'll come back to this later, because there's a specific woman in the Bible whose story embodies this particular horror. Bodily discharges of any kind made you unclean. Infections, open wounds, certain diseases. Even normal bodily functions could render you temporarily unfit for community life. The priest had enormous power in this system. He was the gatekeeper, the arbiter, the one who decided whether you could stay or had to go, whether you were fit for community or condemned to exile. And the examination process itself was humiliating. You had to strip, had to let this man, this religious official, inspect your body intimately, check every inch of your skin, look for signs, make his determination. If he declared you clean, you could go home. Relief, gratitude, life continues. If he declared you unclean, everything ended, and there was no appeal process, no second opinion, no medical review board. His word was final, absolute, binding. So you'd stand there, naked and vulnerable, while he examined you, and you'd pray, desperately pray, that he'd see nothing significant, that he'd let you go home. But if your skin showed the wrong signs, if the lesions were spreading, if there was raw flesh, then you'd hear those terrible words, unclean, and your world would collapse. The walk out of the city was called the walk of shame. Everyone would know where you were going, why you were leaving. Children would stare. Adults would look away. Some people might weep for you. Others would whisper that you must have sinned, that God was punishing you, that you brought this on yourself. And maybe some dark part of you would wonder if they were right. Outside the gates, in the community of outcasts, you'd find others like you, people with skin diseases, people with chronic discharges, people who'd been living in exile for months, years, decades. Some had lost hope entirely. They just existed, waiting for death. Others maintained a desperate optimism, believing that someday, somehow, they'd be healed, that they'd be allowed to go home. Most would die outside those walls. They'd die alone or among other outcasts, never again embraced by their loved ones, never again kissed or held or touched with love. The loneliness was crushing. The isolation was complete. And the worst part, you could see the city. You could see the walls. You could see people going about their lives. You were close enough to smell cooking fires, to hear children playing, to recognize voices, but you couldn't join them. You were right there, but you might as well have been on another planet. This was what it meant to be unclean in biblical times. It wasn't just about being sick. It was about being erased, being removed from society, being treated as though you no longer fully existed. And the cruelty of it was that you hadn't done anything wrong. You'd just gotten sick. Your body had betrayed you. And now, everything else betrayed you too. Your community, your laws, your very humanity questioned and denied. So when you hear stories from the Bible about Jesus touching lepers, about him reaching out and making physical contact with the unclean, about him welcoming them back into community, understand what that meant. Understand the radical nature of that act. He was touching people who hadn't been touched in years. He was seeing people who'd been rendered invisible. He was restoring humanity to those who'd been declared less than human, because that's what the law did. It protected the many by sacrificing the few. It kept disease from spreading by casting out the diseased. It maintained purity by exiling the impure. And if you were one of the exiled, one of the cast out, one of the impure, you learned what it meant to be truly alone, unclean, forever unclean. Now, let's talk about what happened when your mind betrayed you. In biblical times, there was no concept of mental illness as we understand it. No understanding of brain chemistry, of neurotransmitters, of psychological conditions. No therapy. No psychiatric medication. No framework for understanding why someone's mind might break down. Instead, they had a different explanation. Demons. If you experienced what we would now call psychosis, if you heard voices, saw things that weren't there, believed impossible things, they said you were demon-possessed. If you had epilepsy, if you suffered seizures, convulsing and foaming at the mouth, losing consciousness, they said a demon was throwing you to the ground. If you had severe depression, if you couldn't function, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't find joy in anything, they said an evil spirit was oppressing you. If you had what might have been schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or any number of conditions we now recognize and treat, they said you were controlled by unclean spirits. And the treatment for demon possession was, well, it was brutal. Let's start with what happened to someone experiencing a mental health crisis in ancient Judea. Imagine you're a young man, maybe in your 20s. You've started hearing voices. They're getting louder, more insistent. They tell you things, dark things, frightening things. You try to ignore them, but they won't stop. You start to believe they're real. Start to respond to them. Start to act in ways that others find disturbing. Your family notices. They're worried, frightened. They don't understand what's happening to you. You've always been normal, but now you're different. Wrong, broken. They take you to the rabbi, to the religious leaders, to anyone who might know what to do. And those leaders, they examine you. They ask questions. They watch your behavior, and they make their determination. You're demon-possessed. An unclean spirit has entered you, has taken control, and it must be driven out. The methods varied. Some exorcists used prayer and fasting. They'd pray over you for hours, days, trying to command the demon to leave in the name of God. And maybe, if your condition was situational or stress-related, this might actually help. The attention, the ritual, the community support, it might ease your symptoms, might give you enough psychological relief to function again. But if your condition was more severe, if you had a chronic mental illness, prayer wasn't going to fix it. And when the exorcism failed, when the demons refused to leave, things got worse. Some believed that physical punishment would drive out demons. They'd beat you, hit you, cause you pain, thinking the demon would flee from the suffering. So on top of whatever psychological agony you were already experiencing, you'd now experience physical abuse from the people who claimed they were trying to help you. Others believed in more extreme measures. If the demon was particularly stubborn, particularly powerful, you might be starved, deprived of food and water. The theory was that weakening your body would weaken the demon's hold. But of course, all it really did was weaken you, make you sicker, more desperate, more broken. And if you were violent, if your condition made you dangerous to yourself or others, then the solution was simple. They'd bind you. They'd take you outside the community, into the wilderness, into caves or tombs, and they'd chain you there, iron chains, shackles around your wrists and ankles, sometimes around your neck, and they'd leave you there, out of sight, out of mind, out of community. The Bible tells us about a man like this, the Gerasene demoniac. He lived among the tombs, naked, crying out day and night. cutting himself with stones. He'd been bound many times, but he was so strong in his madness that he broke the chains. So they just left him there, let him live like an animal among the dead. This was the solution. This was the care system. Exile and chains. Imagine being that person. Imagine your mind fragmenting, reality becoming impossible to grasp. And instead of receiving help, instead of being treated with compassion, you're declared possessed. You're beaten, starved, chained in a cave. You're alone, except for the voices in your head that won't stop. The hallucinations that seem more real than reality. The terror that consumes every moment. And everyone believes it's your fault. That you sinned, that you opened yourself to evil, that you brought this on yourself. The isolation was complete. The suffering was total. And there was no hope of recovery, because no one understood what was actually wrong with you. Let's talk about epilepsy for a moment. It's a neurological condition. We understand it now. We can treat it with medication. People with epilepsy can live completely normal lives. But in biblical times, when someone had a seizure, when they fell to the ground, convulsing, eyes rolling back, mouth foaming, body rigid and shaking, it looked like something supernatural was happening, like an invisible force was attacking them, throwing them down, trying to kill them. So they called it demon possession, and they tried to cast out the demon. The Gospel of Mark tells a story about a boy with epilepsy. His father brings him to Jesus and describes the symptoms. A spirit seizes him and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. That's epilepsy. We know that now. But they didn't. They saw demonic attack. And if your family couldn't find someone to successfully cast out the demon, you lived with those seizures, fell into fires, fell into water, injured yourself repeatedly. And every time it happened, it confirmed everyone's belief that you were possessed, that evil lived inside you. Depression, severe depression, was another condition they didn't understand. If you lost all motivation, all joy, all will to live, if you couldn't get out of bed, couldn't function, couldn't see any reason to continue, they didn't say you had depression. They said you were oppressed by evil spirits. And the treatment? Prayer, fasting, exorcism. And if those didn't work, well, maybe you weren't praying hard enough. Maybe your faith was weak. Maybe you were secretly sinning, and that's why God wasn't helping you. The psychological burden of this cannot be understated. You're already suffering from a mental illness. Your brain isn't functioning properly. You can't control your thoughts, your moods, your perceptions. And on top of that suffering, you're told it's your fault. You're told you're possessed. You're told you're evil. The shame was crushing. The guilt was overwhelming. And there was no escape. No medication to rebalance your brain chemistry. No therapy to help you process and manage your symptoms. No support groups. No understanding. Just judgment. Just fear. Just isolation. Some people with mental illness were killed. If they were deemed too dangerous, too possessed, too far gone, they might be stoned, executed, put to death for the protection of the community. Others were simply abandoned, left to wander, left to die. Their families would disown them, unwilling to bear the shame of having a demon-possessed relative, unwilling to continue caring for someone who might never recover. And if you survived, if you somehow managed to live with your condition, you lived on the absolute margins of society. People avoided you. Children threw stones at you. Adults whispered about you. You were a cautionary tale, a warning, an example of what happened when you strayed from God. Your humanity was denied. Your suffering was misunderstood. Your illness was demonized, literally, and there was no hope, no real hope, because the treatment was ineffective and the understanding was wrong and the compassion was absent. In our modern world, mental illness still carries stigma. We still struggle with understanding and compassion, but we have treatment. We have medication. We have therapy. We have support systems. We have hope. In biblical times, you had chains. You had caves. You had isolation. You had demons to explain what medicine could not. And if you were the one suffering, if you were the one hearing voices or seeing visions or losing touch with reality, you faced that suffering completely alone. Branded as possessed, treated as dangerous, feared and rejected and exiled. Your mind betrayed you, and then everyone else betrayed you too. This was mental illness in biblical times. This was the fate of those whose brains didn't work the way they should. This was the reality for anyone whose consciousness fractured. Demons in the mind, chains on the body, exile from humanity, and no way out, no way forward, no way back to who you used to be. Just darkness, just voices, just endless, incomprehensible suffering. Welcome to mental health care 2,000 years ago. Let's talk about surgery. Actually, let's talk about what passed for surgery in biblical times. Because calling it surgery, that word that implies precision and care and medical expertise, that's almost too generous. In our modern world, surgery is remarkable. You're put under general anesthesia. You feel nothing. You remember nothing. Skilled surgeons use sterile instruments to perform incredibly complex procedures. And when you wake up, you're given pain medication. You're monitored. You're cared for. You heal. In biblical times, surgery was a last resort, a desperate measure, and it was absolutely horrifying. First, let's establish something important. There was no anesthesia as we know it. None. If you needed surgery, you were awake for it. Fully conscious, fully aware, feeling everything. The absolute best-case scenario was that someone gave you strong wine to drink beforehand, enough to make you drunk, to dull your senses somewhat. Or if you were incredibly wealthy, if you had access to rare imported goods, you might get some opium. A small amount mixed with wine. It would take the edge off, make you drowsy, make the pain slightly more bearable. But slightly more bearable is still conscious, still aware, still feeling the blade cutting through your flesh. Most people, they got nothing. Maybe a leather strap to bite down on. Maybe strong men to hold them still. And that was it. So picture this. You have an abscess, a deep infection, swollen and agonizing. It needs to be drained. In our time, you'd get a local anesthetic. You wouldn't feel the incision. You might not even need to watch. In biblical times, you'd lie down or maybe sit, and someone with a knife would cut into you. You'd feel the blade pierce your skin, feel it slide deeper. Feel the pressure as they spread the wound open. Feel the burning, white-hot pain as infection and pus drained out. And you'd have to stay still, have to endure it, have to remain conscious through the entire procedure because there was no alternative. And that's one of the simpler procedures. Let's talk about bloodletting. It was one of the most common medical interventions in the ancient world. The theory, and understand this was actually believed by educated people, was that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors. Too much blood made you sick, so the solution was to remove some blood. They'd cut a vein, usually in your arm, and they'd let you bleed into a bowl, pint after pint, until they decided you'd lost enough, until they thought the balance was restored. Did this help? Of course not. If anything, it made people weaker, made them more susceptible to disease, made their recovery slower. But they believed in it, firmly. So people underwent bloodletting regularly, willingly weakening themselves, believing it was medical treatment. Now, broken bones. In our world, we set bones. We cast them. We use surgical pins or plates if necessary. The bone heals properly. You regain full function. In biblical times, if you broke a bone, someone had to set it manually. They'd grab the broken limb, pull it straight, feel for the bone alignment, and wrap it tightly. No X-rays to check if it was done correctly. No pain medication while they yanked your broken bone back into place. Just you and your screaming and the sickening sensation of bone grinding against bone. And if it was set incorrectly, it would heal wrong. You'd be permanently deformed, permanently disabled. A broken leg that healed crooked meant you'd limp for the rest of your life. A broken arm that healed poorly meant reduced function, reduced ability to work, reduced value in a society where physical labor was everything. Let's talk about amputations, because sometimes an injury would become infected. Gangrene would set in. The flesh would begin to rot, turn black, smell like death. And the only treatment, the only way to save your life, was to remove the infected limb entirely. So you'd be held down. Multiple people gripping your arms, your legs, your shoulders. Someone would put a leather strap in your mouth, tell you to bite down. And then a surgeon, and I use that term loosely, would take a saw, a crude iron saw, and they'd begin to cut, through skin, through muscle, through bone, and you'd feel everything, every scrape of the saw teeth, every severing of nerve endings, every fraction of an inch as the blade worked through your limb. You'd scream. Of course you'd scream. Everyone screamed. The sound of amputation, the shrieks and wails, it was something everyone in biblical times was familiar with. You'd hear it coming from the medical quarter, hear it echo through streets, hear it and know that someone was losing a part of their body. And once the limb was removed, they'd cauterize the wound. Stop the bleeding. How? With a hot iron. They'd heat a piece of metal until it glowed red, and then press it against your bleeding stump. The smell of your own flesh burning, the sound of tissue sizzling, the pain beyond anything else you'd experienced, even beyond the amputation itself. And then, assuming you didn't die from shock or blood loss or infection, you'd survive as an amputee in a world with no prosthetics, no wheelchairs, no accessibility accommodations. If you lost a leg, you were likely done working, done providing for yourself. You'd become dependent on charity, a beggar, a burden, all because of an infection that in our modern world would be cleared up with a round of antibiotics. Let's talk about infection for a moment, because infection was the real killer. Surgery didn't kill most people, infection did. There was no concept of germs, no understanding of sterilization, no antiseptics, no antibiotics. The tools used for surgery were cleaned, maybe with water or wine. They weren't sterilized. They carried bacteria from previous patients, from the environment, from everywhere. So when you were cut open, bacteria entered your wound immediately, and your body had to fight it off with no help whatsoever. Most people developed infections after surgery. Their wounds would become red, swollen, hot to the touch. Pus would form, fever would set in, and they'd either fight it off and survive, or they'd succumb and die. The mortality rate for any significant surgery was probably over 50%, maybe much higher. You had a coin flip's chance of surviving, and if the surgery was particularly invasive, if they had to cut deep into your body cavity, your chances got much worse. There were no surgeries inside the chest or abdomen. None. Opening someone up like that was a death sentence. The infection rate was 100%. So conditions that we routinely operate on today, appendicitis, intestinal blockages, internal injuries, they were simply fatal. If something went wrong inside your body, inside your chest or your belly, you died. That was it. Sometimes surgeons would attempt to stitch wounds. They'd use thread made from animal sinew or plant fibers. They'd thread it through a crude needle, and they'd sew up the wound as best they could. But the thread wasn't sterile. The needle wasn't sterile. Their hands weren't clean. So even the stitches themselves could introduce infection. The people who performed these surgeries weren't what we'd call doctors. Not really. Sometimes they were priests, because priests dealt with ritual purity issues, and that tangentially involved medical knowledge. Sometimes they were barbers because they had sharp tools and steady hands. Sometimes they were just people who'd done it before, who'd gained a reputation for being able to set bones or drain abscesses or pull teeth. There was no medical school, no training program, no standardization. You learned by watching, by doing, by trial and error. And the errors, well, the errors meant people died. But when you were in agony, when you had an abscess that wouldn't stop growing, when you had a wound that was clearly infected, when you had a tooth that was rotting in your skull, you didn't have many options. You could suffer and hope it resolved on its own, or you could seek out someone who claimed they could help and submit yourself to surgery without anesthesia, knowing you might die from the procedure itself or from infection afterward. Most people chose to suffer. Surgery was too risky, too painful, too likely to end in death. So they lived with their conditions. They endured abscesses until they burst on their own. They let infected wounds drain naturally. They lived with broken bones that healed incorrectly. They pulled their own rotten teeth if they got desperate enough, because sometimes doing nothing was safer than seeking help. Let me tell you what a typical surgical experience might have looked like. You've been injured. Maybe you were working in the fields and a tool slipped and cut deep into your leg. It's been days now. The wound is hot, swollen. Red streaks are creeping up toward your knee. You have a fever. You just know that something is very wrong. Your family takes you to see a man who's performed surgeries before. He examines your leg, touches the swollen area. You cry out in pain. He nods, says the wound needs to be opened and cleaned, says infection is spreading, and if it reaches your knee, if it gets much worse, he'll need to take the leg. So you agree. What choice do you have? They bring you into a room, lay you on a table. Two strong men position themselves on either side of you. Your family waits outside. They can't bear to watch. The surgeon gives you wine. You drink as much as you can stomach. It burns going down. Makes your head swim, but you're still completely aware, still completely present. He shows you a knife, tells you he's going to cut along the original wound, make it bigger, clean it out. You nod, grip the edges of the table. One of the men gives you a leather strap. You put it between your teeth, and then the surgeon cuts. The pain is immediate, overwhelming, white-hot and all-consuming. You scream around the leather strap. Your body tries to jerk away, but the men hold you down, hold you still. The surgeon is focused, working quickly, spreading the wound open. You can feel his fingers inside your leg. Feel him scraping away infected tissue. Feel things tearing inside you that should never tear. You're sobbing, begging, but he doesn't stop. Can't stop. This has to be done. He pours wine into the wound. It burns like fire, like acid. You're sure you're going to die. Sure you can't take any more. But he keeps working, keeps cleaning, keeps cutting away the bad tissue. And then, finally, he's done. He packs the wound with clean cloth, wraps your leg tightly, steps back. You're drenched in sweat, shaking, in shock. The men release you, help you sit up. The surgeon tells you the wound needs to be cleaned daily, that it needs to stay wrapped, that you need to watch for more signs of infection, that if the red streaks continue spreading, if the fever gets worse, you need to come back immediately, because if it gets worse, he'll have to take the leg. You go home. You recover slowly. The pain continues for days, weeks. You can't work, can't walk properly. Your family cares for you, hopes you'll heal, hopes the infection won't return, and you survive. This time, you're lucky. The infection doesn't spread further. The wound eventually closes. You're left with a thick scar and reduced mobility in that leg, but you keep the leg. You survive, but you know people who weren't so lucky. You know people who underwent similar procedures and died, who developed fevers that wouldn't break, whose wounds turned septic, who lost limbs, who lost lives. You know that surgery is a gamble, a desperate last resort, something you only do when the alternative is certain death. This was surgery in biblical times. This was medical intervention. This was the choice between suffering and risk, between pain and possible death, between enduring and hoping for the best. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, no sterilization, no real understanding of what caused infection or how to prevent it. Just blood and blades and screaming and prayer, and the knowledge that most people who underwent significant surgery didn't survive. So when you hear about miraculous healings in the Bible, when you read about someone being instantly cured of a chronic condition or a serious injury, understand what the alternative was. Understand that seeking medical help was often worse than staying sick. That surgery meant torture. That treatment meant risk. And understand why people were desperate for miracles. Why they'd travel miles to see a healer. Why they'd push through crowds just to touch someone's cloak. Because the medical establishment, such as it was, offered very little hope. It offered blood and blades and pain, and maybe, if you were very lucky, survival. Now let's talk about something that happened countless times every single day in the ancient world, something that was simultaneously celebrated and feared, something that brought new life into the world and frequently took life away: childbirth. In our modern world, in developed nations, giving birth is relatively safe. Not without risk, never without risk, but we have prenatal care, ultrasounds, hospital delivery rooms, trained obstetricians, emergency C-sections, blood transfusions, antibiotics, pain relief. The maternal mortality rate in places like the United States is about 23 deaths per 100,000 live births. That's still too high, but it's manageable, survivable. In biblical times, the estimates vary, but most historians believe that somewhere between 1 in 8 and 1 in 20 women died in childbirth. Let that sink in. 1 in 8. That means if you knew 8 women who'd given birth, one of them probably didn't survive it. For women in biblical times, pregnancy wasn't just a blessing. It was Russian roulette. Every woman who became pregnant knew she might die. Every family knew they might lose their daughter, their sister, their wife. Every child knew their mother might not survive bringing another baby into the world. Death in childbirth was expected, normal, common. Let me paint you a picture of what childbirth looked like in ancient Judea. You're a young woman, maybe 16 years old. You've just been married. Within months, you're pregnant. Your first child. Your family is happy. Your husband is proud. You're fulfilling your primary role, bringing forth life, continuing the family line. But you're also terrified. You've seen women die in childbirth. Your own mother, she survived having you and your siblings, but her sister didn't. Your neighbor 2 houses down, she died last year, bringing her 3rd child into the world. The baby died too. You remember the wailing, the grief, the body being prepared for burial. You know this might kill you. As your pregnancy progresses, you prepare. Not just baby clothes and supplies, but your own affairs. You say things to your loved ones that sound like goodbyes, just in case. You reconcile any broken relationships. You pray constantly. Beg God for survival, for safe delivery. You're not being dramatic. You're being realistic. When your labor begins, when the contractions start, your female relatives gather. Your mother, if she's alive, your sisters, aunts, neighbors, a midwife if you can afford one. They send the men away, this is women's work, and they prepare the room. They lay out cloths, bring water, gather whatever herbs might help with pain or bleeding. They help you into position, maybe squatting, maybe kneeling, positions that use gravity to help the baby descend. And then you labor for hours, sometimes many hours, sometimes days. The pain comes in waves, overwhelming, all-consuming. You cry out, you scream, you beg for it to be over. The women around you encourage you, tell you you're strong, tell you to push, hold your hands, wipe your face. But they're also watching, carefully, checking for danger signs. Is the baby positioned correctly? Head down is normal. But if the baby is breech, feet, or bottom first, that's very dangerous. The midwife might try to turn the baby from outside, pressing on your belly, trying to manipulate the baby's position. It's agonizing, and it doesn't always work. If the baby is breech and won't turn, you're in serious danger. Breech births can result in the baby getting stuck, can result in umbilical cord compression, can result in both mother and baby dying. Is the baby too large? Sometimes babies simply don't fit through the birth canal. In our world, that means an emergency C-section. In biblical times, it meant the mother would labor until she was exhausted, until she couldn't push anymore, until something gave way. Sometimes the baby would die in the birth canal, and then the midwife would have to try to remove it, piece by piece. It's horrific, traumatic, and incredibly dangerous for the mother. Is the mother bleeding too much? Some bleeding is normal. But if the placenta tears wrong, if there's hemorrhaging, a woman could bleed out in minutes. And there was nothing anyone could do. No blood transfusions, no emergency surgery. Just watching her die, trying to stop the bleeding with pressure, with herbs, with prayer, but mostly just watching. Let's talk about the moment of birth itself. The baby's head crowns. The midwife guides it out. One more push and the head is free. Then the shoulders, the hardest part. If the baby's shoulders are too wide, they can get stuck. Shoulder dystocia. It's an emergency. The baby can suffocate. The mother can hemorrhage. The midwife has to act fast. Try to manipulate the baby free. And if she can't, both mother and baby can die within minutes. But let's say the birth goes well. The baby emerges, takes its first breath, cries. The midwife cuts the umbilical cord, ties it off with thread, hands the baby to one of the women to be cleaned while she attends to the mother. The placenta still needs to be delivered. Usually it comes out on its own, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it stays partially attached to the uterine wall, and if it's not fully expelled, if pieces remain inside, the mother will develop an infection, childbed fever, puerperal sepsis, and that infection will kill her. Not immediately. It takes days. She'll develop a fever, chills, pain in her abdomen. The infection spreads through her body, through her blood, and there's no treatment. No antibiotics, nothing. She'll die, slowly, agonizingly, while her newborn baby nurses from someone else, while her family grieves, while her husband looks for someone else to care for his children. Childbed fever killed countless women, even women whose births seemed successful, even women who survived the delivery itself. Days later, weeks later, the fever would set in, and they'd be gone. Rachel, in the book of Genesis, she dies giving birth to Benjamin. The text is brief, almost matter of fact. And Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. That's it. She labored. She delivered. She died. It was common enough not to require detailed explanation. Every pregnant woman in biblical times knew Rachel's story, knew it could be their story. Let's talk about the babies, because even if the mother survived, the baby might not. Infant mortality was staggering. Best estimates suggest that 30 to 40% of babies died before their first birthday. Before age 5, nearly half. Half of all children born would die young. Some died at birth, stillborn, or born not breathing. The midwife would try to stimulate them, rub them, pat their backs, blow air into their mouths. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Some died in the first few days, unable to nurse properly, unable to maintain body temperature. Infections, complications from difficult births. Some died from diseases we now vaccinate against. Whooping cough, diphtheria, measles. Diseases that swept through communities and devastated families. Parents in biblical times didn't allow themselves to become too attached to newborns. Not at first. They waited, watched, hoped the baby would survive, but they protected themselves emotionally because odds were they'd lose children. Multiple children, every family had graves, tiny graves. Children who didn't make it, Now, let's talk about the experience of labor itself, the pain. In our world, we have options: epidurals, pain medication, relief. You can give birth without feeling much of anything. In biblical times, you felt everything, every contraction, every stretch, every tear, everything. The pain of childbirth is intense. Even with modern pain relief, even with support and medical care, it's recognized as one of the most painful experiences humans endure. Now, remove all the pain relief. Remove all the medical support. Remove any certainty of survival. That was childbirth for every woman in the ancient world. Some women were given wine to dull the pain slightly. Some midwives had herbs, concoctions that supposedly helped. Probably they did very little, but the women who labored took them anyway, desperate for anything that might help. Mostly, though, they endured. They screamed. They gripped the hands of the women around them. They pushed when told to push. They breathed when told to breathe. They survived or they didn't. There was a prayer in Jewish tradition, a prayer for women in labor, asking God for protection, for safe delivery, for survival. Women prayed this prayer desperately, continuously, because they absolutely knew that survival wasn't guaranteed. And the men, the husbands and fathers and brothers, they waited outside. They heard the screaming, the hours of screaming, and they waited to hear either a baby's cry or the wailing that meant something had gone terribly wrong. Childbirth shaped families in ways we can barely understand. If a woman survived her first birth, she'd likely have to do it again, and again, and again. Women in biblical times often had many children, partly because so many died young. You needed to have many just to ensure some survived to adulthood. But every pregnancy was another roll of the dice, another chance of death. After her second or third or fourth birth, after a woman had survived multiple times, there was a sense of borrowed time. How many times can you cheat death? How many times before your luck runs out? Some women did die on their sixth or seventh child. After surviving multiple births, they'd hemorrhage, or develop an infection, or have complications, and they'd die, leaving behind a large family and a grieving husband. Widowers would remarry quickly, not because they didn't love their first wives, but because they needed help, needed someone to care for the children, needed someone to run the household. And that new wife, she'd often get pregnant too, and face the same risks, the same gambit. The social pressure on women to bear children was immense. It was your primary purpose, your value. Barren women were pitied, scorned, seen as cursed. So even knowing the risks, even having watched women die, you still tried to get pregnant, still hoped to carry children, still submitted to the danger, because not having children was seen as worse than dying in childbirth. Let me tell you about a woman named Leah. Not a specific person, but a composite, a typical woman of biblical times. Leah marries at 15, gets pregnant at 16, labors for 18 hours, nearly dies from bleeding, but survives. Her daughter survives. A year later, pregnant again. This time the labor is faster. Her son is born healthy. She recovers, gets pregnant again. This baby is breech. She labors for 2 days. The midwife finally manages to turn the baby. It's born alive. Leah tears badly. Takes months to heal. Gets pregnant again. This time the baby doesn't survive. Stillborn. She grieves, gets pregnant again, twins. The first is born fine. The second, stuck, dies during delivery. Leah hemorrhages, almost dies, survives barely, gets pregnant one more time. She's 23 years old, has been pregnant 6 times in 7 years. This labor is difficult. She's exhausted, weakened from previous births. She delivers a son, but develops a fever days later. Childbed fever. Dies within a week. Leaves behind 4 living children and a husband who will remarry within months. This was not unusual. This was common, expected, normal. Childbirth in biblical times was deadly. It was celebrated because children were necessary, but it was also feared, appropriately feared. Every pregnant woman made peace with the possibility of death. Every family accepted that they might lose their daughter, their wife, their sister. And when women survived, when they made it through labor and recovery and lived to raise their children, it was recognized as a genuine miracle. Not a medical success because there was no real medical care, but a miracle, the intervention of God, divine protection, because without intervention, divine or otherwise, the odds were against them. 1 in 8, maybe 1 in 20 if you were lucky. If you were healthy and young and had good midwives and favorable circumstances. But even in the best circumstances, childbirth could kill you. This was the price of bringing life into the world. This was the gambit every woman faced. This was the dangerous miracle of birth. We've talked about pain, about isolation, about mental illness and surgery and childbirth. But let's zoom out for a moment. Let's talk about the bigger picture, about life expectancy in biblical times, about how long people actually lived. The average lifespan in ancient Judea was somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. Now that's misleading in one important way. That average is dragged down by infant mortality. Remember, 30 to 40% of children died before age 5. If you survived childhood, if you made it to adulthood, your life expectancy improved significantly. You might live into your 50s or even 60s. But even so, people aged faster, wore out faster, died younger than we do now. If you were 50 years old in biblical times, you were elderly. Genuinely old, your body would be breaking down. Your teeth would be rotting or gone. Your joints would ache constantly. Your eyesight would be failing. You'd probably have multiple chronic conditions. You'd be slowing down, winding down. 60 was ancient. 70 was practically unheard of. The Bible mentions people living to 70 or 80, but treats it as exceptional, as a blessing, as something noteworthy. Most people didn't make it that far. Why? Why did people die so young? Let's start with the obvious. Infant and childhood mortality. If you survived being born, you still had to survive early childhood. And childhood was dangerous. Infectious diseases swept through communities regularly. Measles, whooping cough, diarrheal diseases from contaminated water, respiratory infections. Children died constantly. It was so common that families, as we mentioned, didn't fully bond with infants until they'd survived a year or 2. The grief was always there, but there was also a protective emotional distance. You had to have it. Otherwise, the losses would destroy you. If you survived childhood, congratulations, you'd made it through the most dangerous phase. But danger didn't disappear. Let's talk about infection. We've mentioned it before, but it bears repeating. Infection killed more people than anything else. a cut from a farming tool, a scrape from a fall, an infected tooth, a skin boil. Any break in the skin, any entry point for bacteria, could lead to fatal infection. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no understanding of germs. Wounds were cleaned with water, maybe wine, and that was it. Your body's immune system had to do all the work, and sometimes, often, it couldn't. Blood poisoning, sepsis. Once infection got into your bloodstream, spread through your body, you died. Fever, chills, organ failure, death. It happened all the time. Let's talk about malnutrition. Most people in biblical times didn't get enough food. Not consistently. Crops failed. Droughts happened. Famines swept through regions. And even in good years, most people's diets were limited. Bread, lentils, maybe some vegetables. Meat rarely. Dairy occasionally. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, made people more susceptible to disease, stunted growth, led to chronic health problems. People were smaller then, shorter, thinner, not because of genetics, but because they simply didn't get enough nutrition during their development years. And malnutrition during pregnancy? That affected babies too. Low birth weight, developmental problems, increased infant mortality. The cycle continued. Generation after generation, never quite getting enough. Let's talk about water. Contaminated water killed countless people. There was no understanding of waterborne diseases. No water treatment. No purification systems. People drank from wells, from streams, from cisterns that collected rainwater, and those water sources were often contaminated with human and animal waste, with bacteria, with parasites, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, all spread through contaminated water, all caused severe diarrhea and dehydration, all killed regularly, especially children. You could drink water one day and be dead 3 days later, just from water. Let's talk about living conditions. Most people lived in small, crowded houses, extended families sharing limited space, poor ventilation, dirt floors, animals sometimes kept inside. Diseases spread rapidly in these conditions. Respiratory infections, skin conditions, parasites. If one person got sick, everyone in the household would likely get sick. And in cities? Even worse, narrow streets, houses built close together, no sewage systems, waste thrown into streets or collected in pits. The smell, the filth, the disease-breeding grounds. Plague and pestilence weren't abstractions in biblical times. They were regular visitors, killing large portions of populations periodically. Let's talk about injuries. Accidents happened constantly. Farming accidents, construction accidents, falls, burns, animal attacks. And remember, there was no real medical care. A broken bone that healed wrong. An injury that got infected, a burn that scarred and restricted movement. These things shortened lives, made you less able to work, less able to survive. And let's talk about violence. Biblical times were not peaceful. Wars, raids, banditry, crime, political upheaval. Young men especially faced violence, conscripted into armies, killed in battles, executed for crimes, murdered in disputes. The world was brutal. Life was cheap. Death was common. For women, childbirth remained the primary killer, as we discussed. But even women who survived childbirth faced constant health challenges, anemia from multiple pregnancies, exhaustion from continuous child care and household labor, wear and tear on bodies that never fully recovered between pregnancies. And remember, people didn't understand rest and recovery the way we do. There was no medical leave, no time off. You worked until you couldn't work anymore, and then you died. The elderly, those who made it to 50 or 60, were often in poor health, in pain, struggling. They couldn't work anymore, couldn't contribute. They relied on their families to care for them. And families did, mostly, because that's what you did. But there was no retirement, no social security, no pension. You worked as long as you physically could, and then you hoped your children would take care of you. Some elderly people were honored, respected for their wisdom and experience, but many were also seen as burdens, another mouth to feed in households that already struggled. The acceptance of death was profound in biblical times. It wasn't denied, wasn't hidden away. People died at home. Their bodies were prepared at home. Funerals happened within 24 hours. Everyone participated in death rituals. Children grew up witnessing death, attending funerals, understanding that life was fragile and brief, that anyone could die at any time. It made people different, more resigned to loss, more accepting of suffering, more focused on spiritual matters because earthly life was so precarious. When the Bible talks about life being but a breath, when it describes humans as grass that withers, these weren't poetic exaggerations. They were observations, accurate descriptions of how brief and fragile life actually was. 30 to 40 years. That was the average. Some lived longer. Many died younger. But either way, life was short, brutal, difficult, and then it ended. Often without warning, often without dignity. Just ended. This was normal. This was expected. This was life in biblical times, short, hard, painful, and brief. So very brief. Now let's meet 3 specific people. 3 individuals whose stories are recorded in the Bible. 3 people whose experiences of sickness and suffering reveal everything we've been talking about. Their stories are brief in Scripture, just a few verses. But when you understand the context, when you understand what life was really like, these stories become profound. So settle deeper into comfort. Let these stories wash over you, and remember you can drift off at any time. That's exactly what should happen. Let's begin. Her name isn't recorded. She's known only by her condition. The woman with the issue of blood. The woman who bled for 12 years. But she was a real person with a real name, a real life, a real story. Let's imagine her. Let's call her Miriam. Miriam was probably young when it started. Maybe early 20s. Maybe she just had a child. Maybe it was after childbirth that the bleeding began. That wouldn't be unusual. Many women developed complications after delivery, hemorrhaging that didn't fully stop, damage to the uterus, conditions we now can treat, but that ancient medicine couldn't understand. Or maybe it started spontaneously, a hormonal problem, a uterine condition, fibroids, endometriosis, something causing abnormal, continuous bleeding. Either way, it didn't stop. At first, she probably thought it would resolve, that it was temporary. She saw midwives, she tried herbs, she rested, she prayed. And still, the bleeding continued. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And Miriam realized this wasn't going away. And then the full horror of her situation became clear. According to Levitical law, a woman's menstrual period made her ritually unclean for 7 days. During that time, she couldn't go to the temple, couldn't participate in worship. Anything she sat on became unclean. Anyone she touched became unclean. This was manageable. Every woman dealt with it monthly. It was temporary, brief, understandable. But Miriam's bleeding was continuous, not cyclical. Not temporary, continuous, which meant she was permanently unclean, every day, every moment, for 12 years. Let's talk about what that meant practically. First, she couldn't touch anyone, at all, ever. Her husband, if she was married, couldn't touch her, couldn't hold her hand, couldn't embrace her, couldn't lie beside her at night. By law, anything she touched became unclean. Her husband would have to ritually purify himself. It was too much, too burdensome. So probably he divorced her. He had grounds. She was permanently unclean, couldn't fulfill her wifely duties, couldn't give him more children. He could divorce her, and likely did. The law permitted it. If she had children, she couldn't hold them, couldn't kiss them, couldn't comfort them when they cried. They'd learn to stay away from her, learn that touching mother made you unclean, made you need to wash, made you different. Imagine that. Imagine being a mother who couldn't touch her own children. Her parents, her siblings, her friends, all had to keep their distance. Social visits became awkward. She'd sit separately, speak from across the room, watch life happening around her but never participate fully. She couldn't cook for her family. Anything she touched in the kitchen became unclean. She couldn't handle food, couldn't prepare meals, couldn't even pour water without contaminating the vessel. She couldn't worship, couldn't go to the temple, couldn't participate in religious festivals, couldn't fulfill her spiritual obligations. And in a society where faith and community were everything, this isolation was devastating. She became invisible. People would see her coming and move away, create distance, avoid eye contact. She was a source of contamination, a problem, a burden. And all the while, the bleeding continued, constant, unrelenting. She'd change the rags between her legs multiple times a day, wash them, try to manage the mess, try to maintain some dignity. The blood loss itself would have made her anemic, weak, tired constantly, pale, unable to do physical labor. But that was almost secondary to the social death she was living. The Gospel of Mark tells us she spent all her money seeking medical help. She saw many physicians. None could help her. In fact, she grew worse. Let's think about that. Let's imagine what she went through. She heard about a physician in a nearby town, someone who claimed to understand women's conditions. So she traveled there, used precious money to pay for a consultation. The physician examined her, probably invasively, probably humiliatingly. He prescribed something, herbs, a tincture, a ritual. She tried it. It didn't work. She heard about another healer, someone who'd supposedly cured similar conditions. She went to him, spent more money. He tried different herbs, different methods. Still, the bleeding continued. One after another, she sought help. Year after year, physician after physician, healer after healer, each one taking her money, each one failing, each one leaving her poorer and sicker and more desperate. 12 years of this, 12 years of bleeding, 12 years of isolation, 12 years of spending everything she had, 12 years of growing weaker, 12 years of hope deferred, 12 years of prayers that seemed unanswered. Mark 5:26 says it plainly. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. She suffered under their care. They hurt her, made her worse, took her money and left her with nothing. By year 12, she was destitute, broke, alone, sick, desperate. And then she heard about Jesus. She heard he'd been healing people, that he'd cleansed lepers, cast out demons, made the blind see, that he didn't care about ritual purity laws, that he touched the untouchable, that he welcomed the outcasts. And something stirred in her, some last remnant of hope, some desperate belief that maybe he could help. But there was a problem, a serious problem. She wasn't supposed to be in crowds. She was unclean. Anyone she touched would become unclean. She'd be violating the law by being there, by pressing into a crowd, by potentially contaminating others. She could be punished, could be publicly shamed, could be driven out violently. But what did she have to lose? She'd already lost everything: her health, her money, her family, her dignity, her place in society. What was left to lose? So she made a plan, a desperate, illegal, dangerous plan. She would go to where Jesus was. She'd wait until he was passing through, surrounded by crowds, and she'd slip into that crowd, blend in, make herself small, invisible, and she'd push forward, fight her way through, get close, and she'd touch his cloak, just the edge of his garment, just the tassels that hung from the corners. That would be enough. It had to be enough. She believed, somehow she believed, that even touching his clothes would heal her. So she went. She found where Jesus was teaching, where crowds were gathered, and she pushed in. People pressed close on every side, bodies everywhere, no personal space. Everyone trying to get closer to this teacher, this healer, this prophet. And Miriam pushed forward, made herself small, squeezed between people, trying not to think about how she was contaminating everyone she brushed against, trying not to think about what would happen if someone recognized her, if someone called her out. She could see him ahead, Jesus, surrounded by disciples, teaching, laughing, alive with energy and purpose. She pushed closer, closer, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. 12 years of desperation focused on this one moment, this one chance, and then she was close enough. Right behind him, she could see the tassels of his cloak, blue and white twisted cords hanging from the corners of his garment. She reached out, just barely, touched the tassel between her fingers, and instantly, she felt something change, felt something shift inside her body, a warmth, a settling, a wholeness she hadn't felt in 12 years. The bleeding stopped, just stopped, in that moment. After 12 years of continuous flow, it simply ended. She knew immediately, knew in her body, knew with absolute certainty. She was healed. But before she could slip away, before she could disappear back into the crowd, Jesus stopped. He turned, looked around, asked, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples were confused. You see the people crowding against you, and yet you ask, "Who touched me?" But Jesus kept looking, searching the crowd. And Miriam realized he knew. Somehow he knew. She could have stayed silent. She could have disappeared. melted back into the crowd, taken her healing and left, but something in his voice, something in the way he was looking, not angry, not accusatory, just searching, wanting to know. So she came forward, trembling, terrified, fell at his feet, and in front of everyone, the whole crowd, she told him the truth, the whole truth. Her 12 years of suffering, her bleeding, her unclean status, her isolation, her desperation, her illegal presence in this crowd, her touch, her healing, all of it. She confessed all of it. And imagine what she expected. Rebuke, anger, shame. She'd broken the law, contaminated people, touched a rabbi without permission. She'd done everything wrong. But Jesus looked at her with such tenderness, such compassion, and he said, "Daughter, daughter, not woman, not unclean one, not violator of the law, daughter." It was the first time in 12 years anyone had claimed her, acknowledged her as belonging, as family, as worthy of tender address. And then he said, "Your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Your faith, not your violation, not your desperation, not your illegal touching. Your faith. He honored her in front of everyone, proclaimed her healing, declared her clean, released her back into community. And more than that, by speaking to her publicly, by acknowledging what had happened, he made sure everyone knew she was healed, that she was no longer unclean, that she was restored not just physically, but socially, spiritually, completely. She didn't have to go back into hiding, didn't have to continue being invisible. He'd proclaimed her healing publicly, witnessed by dozens, hundreds. She was clean, she was whole. She could go home, could touch her children again, could embrace her family, could prepare meals, could worship, could live. 12 years of death ended in a moment, ended by faith, ended by a touch, ended by a man who saw her, really saw her, not as a contamination, not as a problem, but as a daughter, worth healing, worth restoring, worth acknowledging. The story is brief in Scripture, just a few verses. Mark 5:25-34, Luke 8:40, 3:48, Matthew 9:20-22. But when you understand what those 12 years meant, when you understand the isolation, the suffering, the social death, the desperation, when you understand what it cost her to push into that crowd, what it risked, what it took, then you understand why this story matters, because she represents everyone who suffers in silence, everyone who's been made invisible, everyone who's been told they're unclean, unworthy, untouchable. She represents the courage it takes to reach out anyway, to seek healing anyway, to have faith anyway, even when you've been disappointed for 12 years, even when every physician failed, even when you've lost everything, even when the law says you should stay away. She reached out anyway, and she was healed, not just physically, but wholly, completely, restored to life, to community, to humanity. The woman who wouldn't stop bleeding finally stopped, finally found rest, finally found peace. After 12 long years, 12 years, can you imagine? Can you imagine 12 years of continuous suffering, of bleeding, of isolation, of trying everything and nothing working, of watching your life drain away, literally and figuratively? Can you imagine the strength it took to keep going, to not give up, to maintain hope? And can you imagine the moment of healing, the instant relief, the wholeness rushing back, the realization that it's over, finally over. Can you imagine hearing yourself called daughter for the first time in 12 years? That's the power of this story. That's why it's recorded. That's why we remember her, even though we don't know her name, because she represents hope. She represents faith. She represents the courage to reach out even when everything says you shouldn't, even when the law forbids it, even when society rejects you, even when you've been bleeding for 12 years. You reach out anyway. And sometimes you find healing on the other side of that reach. Rest now. Let her story settle into you. Let it remind you that no suffering is forever, that no isolation is permanent, that even 12 years of bleeding can end in a moment, when faith meets compassion, when desperation meets divine love, when reaching out meets someone who sees you, really sees you. Daughter, son, beloved Ho. His name was Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar from Jericho. That's how the Gospel of Mark identifies him. One of the few people in Jesus' healing stories who's actually named. Most are anonymous, but Bartimaeus gets a name, gets an identity, gets remembered. And maybe that's fitting, because his entire existence was about being seen, about refusing to be invisible, about making himself heard even when everyone told him to be quiet. But let's start at the beginning. Let's understand what it meant to be blind in biblical times. If you were born blind, or if you became blind through disease or injury, your life was essentially over. Not in the sense of death, but in the sense of independence, of purpose, of meaningful existence. There was no braille, no mobility training, no guide dogs, no accessibility accommodations, no disability support, no white canes, no audiobooks, no assistive technology, nothing. If you couldn't see, you couldn't work, couldn't farm, couldn't do construction, couldn't be a merchant or tradesman, couldn't do any of the physical labor that constituted most employment, which meant you couldn't earn money, couldn't support yourself, couldn't contribute to your family's welfare. You became completely dependent on family if you were lucky, on charity if you weren't. And Bartimaeus, he wasn't lucky. Maybe he had family once. Maybe he lost them. Maybe they died. Maybe they abandoned him. We don't know. But what we do know is that when we meet him in the gospel, he's begging by the roadside, alone, poor, desperate. Begging was the only option for disabled people in biblical times, the only way to survive. So Bartimaeus sat by the road, every day, in the same spot. Jericho was on a major trade route. Travelers passed constantly. Pilgrims going to Jerusalem. Merchants, Romans, locals, and Bartimaeus would call out, "Mercy, please." Alms for a blind man, mercy, over and over, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. Most people ignored him, walked past. Some maybe tossed a small coin, a lepton, worth almost nothing, but enough to buy a bit of bread, enough to survive another day. This was his entire existence. Sitting, waiting, begging, hoping for enough charity to eat, to survive. Let's think about what that daily experience was like. Bartimaeus wakes up. He's sleeping rough, maybe in a doorway or under an awning, some semi-sheltered spot where beggars congregate. He's stiff, cold. The morning air is chilly. He feels around for his cloak. His only possession, really, worn, patched, but essential. He wraps it around himself, feels his way to his usual spot by the road. He knows the way by touch, by counting steps, by the sound of his footsteps. By memory, he settles into position, sits cross-legged on the dusty ground, arranges his cloak, makes himself visible as a beggar, pathetic, worthy of pity, and he begins to call out, "Mercy, alms, please." He hears footsteps approaching, multiple people. A group. He calls louder, "Mercy, please." The footsteps pass. No one stops. No coin drops into his lap. More footsteps. A single person this time, walking quickly. Bartimaeus calls out, "Sir, please. Mercy for a blind man." The footsteps slow. Stop. He hears the clink of coins. Someone digging in a pouch. A small coin drops into his lap. He feels it. A lepton. Almost worthless, but something. "Thank you. Bless you. Thank you." He calls out gratitude. Make sure the person feels good about their charity. Make sure they might give again next time. The footsteps continue, and Bartimaeus waits, listening, calling, hoping. Hours pass. The sun rises. Gets hot. Bartimaeus is thirsty. He hears a water seller passing. Water. Fresh water. Bartimaeus holds up his lepton. "Water, please." The water seller stops. Bartimaeus hears liquid pouring. A cup is pressed into his hands. He drinks deeply, hands it back, gives up his lepton, his only coin. Now he has nothing again. But at least he's had water. The day continues. More people pass. Some give. Most don't. By afternoon, Bartimaeus has collected a few more small coins. Maybe enough for some bread later. Maybe not. He's hungry. Always hungry. Beggars never get enough food. Never get proper nutrition. His body is thin, malnourished, weak, but he keeps calling out, keeps begging. What else can he do? This is survival. This is his life. Day after day after day. The humiliation of it is profound. Having to beg. Having to make yourself pathetic. Having to rely entirely on the whims of strangers. Having no dignity, no pride, no autonomy. Just dependence. Complete and total dependence. And the loneliness. Bartimaeus is alone constantly. Yes, there are other beggars around. They form a kind of community, but it's not friendship, really. It's just shared misery, shared desperation. They're competing for the same limited charity. They're not allies. Not really. At night, when the crowds thin, when the charity dries up, Bartimaeus feels his way back to his sleeping spot. He huddles in his cloak. He's cold, hungry, tired. He dreams sometimes. Dreams of seeing, of walking freely, of working, of having purpose, of being valuable instead of pitiable. But when he wakes, he's still blind, still begging, still trapped. Years pass like this. We don't know how long Bartimaeus had been blind, how long he'd been begging, but long enough that everyone in Jericho knew him. Oh, that's Bartimaeus, the blind beggar. He's always there by the road. He became part of the landscape, expected, familiar, invisible in his visibility. And then one day something different happened. Bartimaeus heard a commotion, a large crowd. Many people, all moving together, talking excitedly. There was energy in the air, something unusual. He called out to someone passing, "What's happening? Who is this?" And someone, some kind soul, answered, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing by." Jesus. Bartimaeus had heard about him. Everyone had heard about him. the teacher, the prophet, the healer. They said he'd made the blind see, the lame walk, the deaf hear. They said he performed miracles, and he was here, right now, passing through Jericho, passing right by where Bartimaeus sat. This was it. This was his chance. Maybe his only chance. Who knew if Jesus would ever pass through Jericho again? This might be once in a lifetime. Bartimaeus began to shout, louder than he'd ever shouted for alms, louder than he'd ever called for mercy. He shouted with everything in him, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Son of David, a messianic title. Bartimaeus wasn't just asking for healing. He was proclaiming faith, declaring that he believed Jesus was the promised one, the anointed King, the Messiah. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." But the crowd, the people around him, they were annoyed. This beggar was being disruptive, making a scene. They told him to be quiet. Shush, be quiet. Don't bother the teacher. But Bartimaeus didn't care. This was his moment, his only chance. What did he have to lose? His dignity? He'd lost that long ago. His reputation? He was a beggar. He had no reputation. So he shouted louder, even louder, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." He was desperate, absolutely desperate. Years of begging, years of darkness, years of dependence, all of it poured into this moment, into this cry for help. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And then the crowd went quiet. Bartimaeus heard footsteps stopping, heard Jesus' voice. Call him. The people who'd been telling him to shut up, suddenly their tone changed. "Get up, he's calling you." Bartimaeus felt a surge of hope, of possibility, of electrical excitement coursing through his body. Jesus was calling him, calling for him, wanting to speak with him. He threw off his cloak, his only possession. Didn't even think about it, just threw it aside, jumped to his feet, stumbled forward. The crowd guided him. "This way, come on. He's right here." And then Bartimaeus was standing before Jesus. He couldn't see him, but he could feel his presence, could sense him somehow. And Jesus asked him a question, a simple question, but also profound. "What do you want me to do for you?" "What do you want?" Jesus asked. Not assumed, not decided for him. Asked, gave Bartimaeus agency, gave him voice, let him name his need. And Bartimaeus, his answer was immediate, clear, desperate. "Rabbi, I want to see. I want to see." After years of darkness, after years of begging, after years of dependence and humiliation and struggle, I want to see. I want to see the sun. Want to see faces. Want to see the road. Want to see my own hands. Want to navigate without help. Want to work. Want to live. Want to be whole. I want to see. And Jesus said, "Go, your faith has healed you." Your faith. The same words he'd said to the bleeding woman. Your faith, not my power, not my mercy. Your faith. The faith that made you shout when others told you to be quiet. The faith that made you throw off your cloak and stumble forward. The faith that proclaimed me as Son of David, even though you couldn't see me. Your faith. And immediately, Bartimaeus could see. Imagine that moment. Imagine living in darkness for years, maybe decades, and then suddenly, sight. Light flooding in, shapes, colors, faces, the world appearing, reality becoming visible. Everything suddenly there, The gospel says he received his sight immediately. And then, here's the beautiful part, he followed Jesus along the road. He didn't go back to begging, didn't return to his spot by the roadside, didn't retrieve his cloak. He just followed, joined the crowd, became a disciple, became a follower, because he could see now, could walk, could function, could participate. He was no longer trapped, no longer dependent, no longer helpless. He could see, and the first thing he chose to see, the first person he chose to follow, was the one who healed him. The story is powerful because it's about more than physical blindness. It's about social invisibility, about being told to be quiet, about being dismissed as unimportant, as a disruption, as not worth Jesus' time. But Bartimaeus refused to be quiet, refused to be invisible. He made himself heard, made himself known, insisted on being seen, ironically, even though he couldn't see. And Jesus stopped for him, called for him, healed him, gave him back not just sight, but life, purpose, dignity. Bartimaeus went from beggar to disciple, from roadside to roadwalker, from dependent to follower, from blind to seeing, all because he refused to stay quiet, because he shouted louder when they told him to shut up, because he had faith that Jesus could help him, would help him. And that faith, that desperate, shouting, refusing to be silenced faith, was honored, rewarded, answered. Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, the blind beggar who wouldn't be quiet, who received his sight, who followed Jesus, his name is remembered, his story is recorded, his faith is celebrated, because sometimes, often, the people everyone tells to be quiet are exactly the people who need to be heard, the ones society dismisses, the ones considered unimportant, the ones begging by the roadside. Those are often the ones with the most to teach us about faith, about persistence, about refusing to accept invisibility. Bartimaeus teaches us to shout, to keep calling, to refuse silence, to throw off whatever holds us back, to stumble forward even when we can't see where we're going. Because sometimes someone stops, someone calls, someone asks what we need, someone heals, and suddenly we can see, and everything changes. Rest now. Let Bartimaeus' shouting fade. Let his story settle. Let yourself imagine that moment, darkness giving way to light, helplessness giving way to wholeness. It can happen. It does happen, even for blind beggars by the roadside, even for us. Now, let's talk about death, because all the suffering we've discussed, all the sickness and pain and struggle, ultimately, it led here, to death, to the one inevitable conclusion of life in biblical times. And the story of Lazarus, more than any other, gives us a window into what death meant, what it looked like, how it happened, how people responded. Lazarus lived in Bethany, a small village about 2 miles from Jerusalem. He lived with his 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. They were friends of Jesus, close friends. Jesus visited their home, ate with them, taught there. They were family to him, not by blood, but by love, by choice, by relationship. And then Lazarus got sick. The Gospel of John doesn't tell us what the illness was, just that he was sick, gravely sick. Sick enough that his sisters were worried, sick enough that they sent an urgent message to Jesus. Lord, the one you love is sick. Come quickly, come help, come heal. Because we've seen you heal others. We know you can do this. Please, come. But Jesus, strangely, didn't come. Not right away. He stayed where he was for 2 more days. 2 crucial days. And during those 2 days, Lazarus got worse. Let's imagine what those days were like in that house in Bethany. Lazarus is lying on his mat. He's burning with fever. His sisters are caring for him, wiping his face with cool cloths, trying to get him to drink water, to eat something. But he can't. He's too weak, too sick. Martha, the practical one, is doing everything she can. She's making herbal remedies. She's keeping the house quiet. She's managing the visitors who come to check on them. She's holding everything together. But inside she's terrified. Mary, the contemplative one, is sitting beside Lazarus, holding his hand, praying, weeping quietly. She can see him failing, see him slipping away, and she feels helpless, utterly helpless. They keep watching the road, waiting for Jesus. He'll come. He has to come. They sent the message. He loves Lazarus. He'll come and heal him like he's healed so many others. But he didn't come, and Lazarus gets worse. His breathing becomes labored, ragged. His fever spikes higher. He stops responding, stops recognizing them, slips into unconsciousness. And then, on the 4th day after they sent the message, Lazarus dies. Just stop breathing. His chest goes still. His skin turns pale, cold. He's gone. Mary and Martha are devastated. They weep. They hold his body. They can't believe it. Can't accept it. Where's Jesus? Why didn't he come? He could have saved him. He could have prevented this. But now it's too late. Lazarus is dead. And in Jewish culture, in biblical times, death set in motion an immediate series of rituals. Death couldn't wait. Bodies decayed quickly in the heat. There was no embalming, no refrigeration, no way to preserve remains. So within hours of death, the preparation began. First, the body had to be washed. Mary and Martha, along with other female relatives and friends, would wash Lazarus's body, clean him, prepare him for burial. It's intimate work, painful work. They're touching their brother's body, seeing him lifeless, knowing they'll never see him alive again. Then, the anointing, they brought spices, expensive spices, myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds worth, an enormous amount. It showed how much they loved him, how much he was valued. They mixed the spices and rubbed them over his body. The fragrance would help mask the smell of decay, would preserve the body slightly, would honor the dead. Then they wrapped him, long strips of linen cloth, wrapped around and around his body, his arms bound to his sides, his legs wrapped together, layer upon layer of linen, cocooning him, securing him. Finally, his face, a separate cloth wrapped around his head, covering his face, the face they loved, the face they'd never see animated again, covered, hidden, gone. This entire process, the washing, anointing, wrapping, it probably took hours. And all the while, Mary and Martha were weeping, as were the other women helping, as were the professional mourners who'd been hired, because, yes, professional mourners were a thing. Families hired women to come and wail, to cry loudly, to express grief publicly. The louder the mourning, the more honor shown to the deceased, the more love demonstrated. So the house was filled with wailing, with crying, with the sound of grief echoing off walls. And outside, men were preparing the tomb. Lazarus's family had a family tomb, a cave cut into rock, with a large stone that could be rolled across the entrance. They rolled the stone away, made sure the interior was prepared, made room for the new body, and then, within 24 hours of death, they carried Lazarus to his tomb. His body was wrapped in spices and linen, carried on a bike, a simple stretcher, with Mary and Martha following behind, with mourners wailing, with friends and neighbors walking in procession. They brought him to the tomb, carried him inside, laid him on a stone shelf, a bench carved into the rock where bodies rested, and then they left, came back outside, and rolled the stone across the entrance, sealing him in, sealing the tomb, committing him to death, to decay, to the earth. The stone scraping across rock, the finality of it, the terrible permanence. Lazarus was dead, buried, gone, and Mary and Martha went home to mourn, to sit Shiva, to receive visitors who came to comfort them, to sit in grief and loss and unanswered questions. Where was Jesus? Why didn't he come? Why did he let this happen? 4 days passed, 4 full days since Lazarus died, and in that climate, in that heat, decay set in quickly. The body was already decomposing, breaking down. The smell would be terrible, unmistakable, the smell of death. And then, finally, Jesus arrived. Martha heard he was coming. She ran to meet him. And the first thing she said, the first words out of her mouth, they're heartbreaking, they're honest, they're human. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. If you had been here, if you had come when we called, if you hadn't delayed, he'd still be alive. You could have saved him. Why didn't you come? It's not anger exactly. It's grief. It's confusion. It's the cry of someone who doesn't understand, who trusted and was disappointed, who hoped and watched that hope die. Jesus, he doesn't defend himself, doesn't explain. He simply asks where they've laid him. Come and see, Martha says. They walk to the tomb. Mary comes too, weeping. Other mourners followed, a crowd gathering. And when Jesus sees the tomb, sees the mourning, sees the grief, something happens. He weeps, the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. He cries. This man knew he was about to raise Lazarus. Who knew death wasn't final here? Who had power over the grave? He still weeps, still feels the weight of death, still grieves alongside those who grieve. And then he says something that sounds impossible. Take away the stone, take away the stone, open the tomb. Let me see him. Martha objects immediately. But Lord, by this time there is a bad odor. He has been there 4 days. 4 days. The decay has started. The smell will be overwhelming. You don't want to open that tomb. You don't want to see or smell what's inside. But Jesus insists. Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they rolled away the stone. The scraping sound again. The opening of the sealed tomb. And immediately the smell. The terrible smell of decay, of death, of a body 4 days rotting in the heat. Everyone covers their noses, steps back. This is awful. This is wrong. You don't open tombs after 4 days. You don't disturb the dead like this. But Jesus stands there, looks into the dark opening, and he prays out loud, thanks the Father, and then he calls in a loud voice, a commanding voice, Lazarus, come out. And inside the tomb something moves. The wrapped body, the dead man, movement, impossible movement. And then, walking, stumbling, Lazarus emerges from the tomb, still wrapped in grave clothes, still bound in linen strips, the cloth still covering his face, but alive, moving, breathing. Take off the grave clothes and let him go, Jesus says. And they do, with shaking hands, with gasps of amazement, with shock and awe and confusion and joy all mixed together. They unwrap him, unwrap the linen, remove the face cloth, and there's Lazarus, alive, whole, returned, the man who was dead for 4 days, the man whose body was decaying, the man they'd mourned and buried and said goodbye to forever, standing there, breathing, alive. The story is miraculous, obviously, but focus for a moment on what it reveals about death in biblical times. Death was immediate, final, irreversible. Once someone died, they were buried within hours. The mourning began immediately. The tomb was sealed, and that was it. That person was gone. There was no hospital to rush them to, no life support, no CPR, no emergency intervention. When breathing stopped, when the heart stopped, death claimed you. Instantly, completely. And the family had to deal with it immediately, had to prepare the body, had to wrap it, had to bury it, had to mourn, all within 24 hours. There was no time to process, no time to prepare emotionally. Death happened and you dealt with it. Ritually, practically, immediately. The smell of death was something everyone was familiar with, not hidden away in funeral homes, not masked by chemicals. Death smelled, bodies decayed. Everyone knew that smell. Everyone had experienced it. It was part of life. The grief was public, loud, demonstrative, not quiet, not private. You hired mourners to wail. You tore your clothes. You sat in ashes. You made your grief known, made it heard, made it visible, because death was common, expected, normal. Every family lost members regularly. Children, parents, siblings, spouses. Death visited frequently. So the rituals around death were well established, immediate, communal. Everyone participated. Everyone knew what to do. And the finality, the absolute finality, was accepted. Once someone was buried, that was it. You'd never see them again in this life. Maybe in the resurrection at the end of days, but not now. Not here. They were gone. Which makes what happened with Lazarus so shocking, so impossible, so revolutionary. Because dead people stayed dead, always. No exceptions, ever, until Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb. And suddenly, death wasn't quite as final as everyone thought. Suddenly, the impossible became possible. Suddenly, there was a man standing there who'd been dead for 4 days, who'd been buried, who'd been rotting, who'd been gone, and now was back. Mary and Martha got their brother back. They got to hug him, talk to him, share meals with him, live with him, love him. Death had claimed him, but death didn't get to keep him. Not this time. The story points forward, points to resurrection, points to the claim that death itself will one day be defeated, that the tomb will not be the final word. That mourning will give way to joy. But in the immediate, in the present, it showed everyone what Jesus meant when he said, I am the resurrection and the life. Not just in the future, not just symbolically, but right now, right here, in a tomb in Bethany, with a man named Lazarus who walked out of death and back into life because of a voice, a command, a call. Lazarus, come out, and he did. Rest now. let this final story settle. Let the image of grave clothes falling away linger. Let the possibility of resurrection, of life from death, of hope from despair, wash over you. Death was common in biblical times, expected, unavoidable. But even death, even final 4-day-old death, wasn't immune to the voice that called life from tombs. That's the promise. That's the hope. That's what these stories point toward. Even in death, especially in death, there is possibility. There is hope. There is a voice that can call us out. Lazarus heard it. Mary and Martha witnessed it. And we remember it. Death doesn't get the final word. Life does. And so we've journeyed together, back through time, back to an era so different from our own, so much harder, so much more painful. We've walked through days without painkillers, through isolation caused by illness, through surgeries without anesthesia, through childbirth that killed mothers regularly, through lives that ended far too soon. We've met a woman who bled for 12 years, a blind beggar who refused to be quiet, a dead man who walked out of his tomb. We've seen what sickness meant when medicine was primitive, when understanding was limited, when suffering was constant. And maybe, just maybe, you're lying there in your comfortable bed, in your climate-controlled room with access to health care and medication and safety, and you're feeling grateful. Grateful for things you've never thought to be grateful for before. Grateful for the bottle of ibuprofen in your medicine cabinet. Grateful for antibiotics. Grateful for anesthesia. Grateful for doctors who understand diseases. Grateful for hospitals. Grateful for all the modern miracles we take completely for granted. That headache that disappears with 2 pills, that's a miracle by their standards. That infection that clears up with antibiotics, that's impossible by their understanding. That surgery you had with anesthesia, that's magic by their experience. That healthy childbirth, that's divine intervention by their expectations. Every day you live past 40, that's borrowed time by their calculations. We are so blessed, so remarkably blessed, not because we're better, not because we deserve it, but because we were born in an era with medical understanding, with treatment options, with hope. The people of biblical times, they were just as human as we are, just as valuable, just as deserving of health and comfort and long life. But they didn't have access to what we have. They suffered in ways we can barely imagine, and yet they persevered, they loved, they hoped, they reached out for healing, they shouted when told to be quiet, they touched garments in crowds, they believed that something better was possible. Their faith in the face of such suffering is remarkable, humbling, challenging. What would our faith look like if we faced what they faced? But tonight you don't have to face that. Tonight you can simply rest. You can let your body sink into comfort. You can breathe easily. You can know that if you wake up with pain tomorrow, relief exists. Help is available. Hope is real. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are blessed beyond measure. So as you drift towards sleep, as these stories fade from your conscious mind, carry with you just this gratitude for the gift of living now, for the miracle of modern medicine, for the blessing of comfort, and perhaps compassion for those in our world who still suffer, who still lack access to care, who still face biblical era challenges in our modern era. May we be grateful. May we be compassionate. May we be people who reach out, who heal, who see the invisible, who call people out of their tombs, just like Jesus did. Rest now. Sleep peacefully. Let gratitude and comfort surround you like warm blankets. Let these ancient stories remind you how precious, how miraculous, how blessed your life truly is. Good night. Sleep well, and may you wake tomorrow grateful for every small miracle you've been taking for granted. The medicine works, the pain stops, the healing happens. The life continues. What a gift. What an absolute gift. Sleep now, sleep.